Hello, welcome to our introduction video to our CEU series, Joining Forces, Empowering Voices, a collaborative approach to supporting adults using high-tech AAC. I'm Shannon Welch. I'm a speech and language pathologist, and with me today is...
Erin Edwards. I'm a board-certified behavior analyst.
This CEU series is made possible through the generosity of the Edith L. Trees Charitable Trust. Before we start with our presentation, I just want to share a little bit about ourselves. We both work at Penn State Health, Penn State College of Medicine. We provide outpatient services at the Department of Behavioral Health and Psychiatry in the Division of Autism Services. We each carry our own caseload, but provide 5 weekly co-treatment sessions for patients with behavioral and complex communication needs who use AAC. Our learning outcomes for today will be as follows. Participants will be able to describe the rationale for SLP and BCBA collaboration when providing services to individuals with complex communication needs and list 3 models for collaboration. Participants will be able to list 7 potential advantages to using high-tech AAC. Participants will be able to list 5 reasons why communication systems and training are important in adulthood. So part 1 of our presentation today is, why are these CEUs for BCBAs and SLPs? So although we are different disciplines, we are unified in our goal of improving the lives of those we serve. Different routes to the same destination. Interprofessional practice, or IPP, where professionals work towards a common goal of value to the individual, so no more silos. Important for us to work together, but there may be confusion or lack of knowledge about what the other discipline does, which can negatively impact our ability to work together. So although we are different disciplines, our main goal is to improve the lives of our patients. And because we are different disciplines, speech and ABA, we have different approaches to therapy, but the main goal is functional communication and improved quality of life. But just because we are different disciplines doesn't mean that we can't or shouldn't work together at the highest level possible, which is IPP. We'll talk more about IPP later on in the presentation, but the main thing to know is that the goal of collaboration is to work together and not isolated in silos. But why is it common practice that we work in isolation in these silos? I would argue that it's because we know very little about each other's field. If we don't know who we are working with, it can be difficult to work together. So who is an SLP and who is a BCBA? So an SLP is a speech-language pathologist. We have our master's in speech and language pathology. We must complete 400 clock hours of direct supervision in graduate school, and then we complete a clinical fellowship following our graduate program. Then we pass the national exam, and we have to complete 30 hours of professional development every 3 years. So what we do primarily is we address needs related to speech, language, cognition, feeding and swallowing, social communication, fluency, voice, and my favorite, AAC. So who is a BCBA? They are a board-certified behavioral analyst. They have their master's in ABA, or applied behavioral analysis. They complete a minimum of 315 clock hours of behavior analytic coursework. They must complete 1,500 to 2,000 hours of supervised fieldwork. They pass a national certification exam, and they complete 32 credits of CEUs per 2-year cycle. So they focus on understanding and improving behavior using procedures and methods-based behavioral principles and research. So now that we know who an SLP is and who a BCBA is, the important question is, what do we have in common? And the answer is quite a lot. So we both provide services across the lifespan, infancy to geriatrics. We provide services across a range of diagnoses, and we provide services in a variety of settings. So schools, hospitals, nursing homes, hospitals, outpatient clinics, private practice, university clinics. I don't remember if I said homes. So given that we overlap in multiple areas, so ages, places, diagnoses, it is almost guaranteed that we will cross paths when providing services to our clients, students, patients. This is especially true when those that we provide services to have complex communication needs, because they're most likely receiving services from multiple specialists, which may include speech and ABA. So why is it important to collaborate? So people are not islands, especially individuals with complex communication needs. They have complex needs that cannot be addressed in isolation at the exclusion of other needs. Collaboration and communication with other professionals and disciplines is important and necessary. And addressing communication needs includes multiple specialties. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, it is not uncommon for patients, students, clients to be receiving multiple services. So speech, ABA, OT, PT, vision, hearing, etc. A lot of skills from different disciplines can be worked on together because our shared goal really is to improve quality of life. Our services shouldn't exist in silos. So OTs and SLPs can work together to help patients with sensory regulation or fine motor skills used in therapy activities. SLPs and BCBAs can work together if a patient is engaging in dangerous behaviors because they don't have a functional or reliable way of communicating what they want or need. So if your patient has different specialties, it's a great opportunity to work together to maximize those skills with different people in different places, in different contexts. Erin and I do this a lot with our co-treatments. We work on skills together. If a patient is engaging in a self-injurious behavior or is aggressive towards another person, she will identify what the patient is trying to communicate, and then I will take that information. And because I work primarily with AAC and speech-generating devices, I will make sure that there is a way for that patient to communicate the need or message. Then we will work together in a session to teach and provide opportunities for that patient to learn that skill. We aren't assigning each other tasks. We are taking our specialized skills and our expertise to structure our therapy sessions where we are working together as a team and not individuals completing their portion of the therapy session or task. It's almost like a dance where sometimes Erin takes the lead in the session and sometimes I do, but most often we just dance together in harmony.
So there are a couple different types of collaboration that we name and list out. And this list really kind of goes from the most siloed, the most individualistic, to the most enmeshed and most combined type of practice that you can do. So the disciplinary is there at the top, where a BCBA and SLP, for example, would just work in isolation. You're just going to do your job and not have very much contact. What most people are probably familiar with is the multidisciplinary. Feel like a lot of our systems and structures are set up that way, where you work together to some degree, but you're also really on your own when you're providing services, and you might meet together for team meetings and for certain things, but not for a lot. So as you go down this list, it's increasing gradient of collaboration. And the IPP, the interprofessional practice, is there at the bottom. So this is the standard that ASHA puts out on their website. The standard is the interprofessional practice for SLPs. And a behavior analysis and practice article from 2021 laid out standards for this type of collaboration, specifically in autism treatment, which is what we specialize in as well. But how do we use this model and really put it into practice? So both fields recognize the advantages of IPP and the superior outcomes that it produces for the clients we treat. But I would also suggest that it makes us as professionals better providers as well. So what does it look like? One example or analogy that we thought about when we were thinking about how to describe these different types of models is kind of traffic and how we drive. We got the idea because a lot of times on these teams, we're told to stay in our lane, right? That's the expectation. Stay in your lane, do what you do, don't cross over and do what somebody else does. So that's really that multidisciplinary team. If you can think of it as SLPs and BCBAs driving on a road with one of those concrete barriers in between, right? They're doing some construction. There's those concrete barriers. You can't cross lanes. You're going to stay in your lane as you're driving. The interdisciplinary, there's a little more collaboration going on, right? So we thought about this as a roundabout. So that circle in the middle might be your team meeting, or it might be a certain behavior plan or a certain speech plan. So you're coming together from different fields, going around that roundabout, but we're all still exiting at our own exits, and doing our own thing primarily when working with the individual that we're serving. Whereas the interprofessional practice, like I said, we're not staying in our lane. You're really crossing over. So there'll be times that a BCBA might do the work of an SLP, or an OT might do the work of a BCBA. So you're really implementing each other's plans, interventions, strategies, and talking about them together. So there's no lane that has to be stayed in. Another common example of this, you can find on the internet. I forget who it's attributed to, but they talked about the multidisciplinary as like a salad, right? So all the vegetables are in there. but they're kind of mixed together. They cross over each other, but they're really individual tastes. Where the interdisciplinary is more like a super stew. So there's a little flavoring of everybody crossing over, but you're still your individual vegetables. And that interprofessional practice is like a cake, right? There's a lot of ingredients in a cake, but you can't taste one ingredient over the other ingredient. They're all intermixed, and you really can't tell them apart as much. So what does this look like in practice? A critical process described in IPP is role release. One definition of this is the transfer or sharing of a specific task, activity, or intervention usually performed by a discipline-specific member of an educational or therapeutic team to another person. So team members really release or let go of intervention strategies from their field for implementation by another team member. So by definition on its own, this should not sound too unfamiliar to any of us. In both of our professions, we readily recognize the need to transfer skills to parents, direct support staff, and other natural supports in the environment. But how often do we think about releasing to other professionals on the team? How often do we think about being on the receiving end and accepting interventions from other professionals on the team? The model suggests a couple components to role release. The first one is role extension. This component focuses on extending yourself within your field of practice, making sure you're engaged in self-improvement with expertise and professionalism. I think we're all pretty good at this part. And if you're watching this training, you probably understand the value of this part, right? Getting CEUs, continuing to educate yourself in your field. The second part is role enrichment. So this involves getting ready to learn about the professional expertise of other people on the team. You might already know their title and vaguely what they do, but this goes a step further in finding out about their procedures, interventions, approaches. How are they serving the individual on the team? It includes figuring out common areas of overlap or contribution. With role expansion, you're sharing ideas and integrating recommendations. In this step, it's also stressed that a common language be used. Different professions have different acronyms, different vernacular ways to refer to skills. And we'll look at some of the common ones between SLPs and BCBAs in a few slides. But similar to the way we use non-technical language to explain strategies to parents, we should be doing that for each other as well. This section also stresses transparency. The skills and knowledge that I bring to the team are not a secret, right? They're for you to know and learn too, just as I need to be open to your expertise and learning more about it. And finally, as I mentioned before, the integration of ideas. In one activity, can you be addressing the goals of multiple professionals on the team? It's usually not that difficult, but if we don't ask other team members or know what they're addressing and how they're addressing it, we can end up with this isolated programming. The fourth component is role exchange. So this is where team members implement techniques from different professional spheres. So there's not an expectation here that a team member would become an expert in the other discipline. You maintain your own expertise in this process, but you also expand your knowledge and your range of intervention skills and the topics and ideas that you might be intervening on. If you're doing it right, this role release process should be ongoing throughout treatment. You also want to provide role support. This piece recognizes the expertise of each role and provides support or backing for other team members. So I might be role supporting when I ask questions about another professional's interventions and expertise and allow them to guide me in learning the techniques. Or when I suggest a way to integrate another team member's intervention into my plan. Or other ways that I just reinforce the interprofessional practice among all the members of the team. So there are some challenges to the IPP approach that we can talk about as well. We have some obvious systemic barriers that stand out. We showed a slide earlier about the extensive education and training in our fields. But did anyone learn about or practice collaboration with other professionals in that training? Probably very few, or in a multidisciplinary way. Our educational and career pathways are rarely set up to help us see the value of collaboration early in our careers. Our billing systems are similar. They're designed for documenting activities specific to the field that could be questioned if they reference other professionals' goals or activities. The billing structure also doesn't reimburse for collaboration time. Many professionals cannot even bill concurrently for services provided together. So we start out with some of these systems set up against IPP. The other big barrier that sticks out to me is the psychological discomfort that may come with it. Again, we start with this ingrained sense that we're the expert in the field. And yes, we all bring a specific expertise to the table. But I've been in plenty of team meetings where had a suggestion shot down pretty quickly without consideration because it was in somebody else's lane. Similarly, I have felt that little twinge when an SLP or OT or PT suggests a behavioral strategy, right? That little voice inside my head saying, hey, that's my job. And IPP takes learning not to react to that initial thought and carefully considering the suggestion. If it fits, that's great. I should consider how we could implement it. And if it doesn't fit, I should be explaining to that other professional in a way that helps them know and learn more, not just because I said so, not just because it's my job, but so that they can apply strategies better in the future for themselves. Working in an IPP team requires that members look inward, identify capabilities and weaknesses in themselves, both as a professional and as a person. IPP asks us to redefine our professional identity with broad boundaries and approach the work with a high degree of transparency, communication, and willingness to both teach and learn from other professionals. We don't always like to talk about these very human types of traits, but I think it's important to acknowledge that it can be difficult. That way we can recognize it in ourselves and when we start to react or withdraw if somebody else shares our lane. And I'm going to pass it over to Shannon to talk about some of the advantages of IPP.
What are the advantages to IPP? It's simple: high quality patient care and positive outcomes. In our clinic, we often hear stories from family members of our adult patients with autism, and it sounds traumatic. They talk about their child never developed the skills to use a communication device. They talk about how they tried everything and nothing worked. When we dig a little bit deeper into their history with school services, we often learn that their services were provided in a multidisciplinary approach, or at best, an interdisciplinary one. And sometimes interventions are so highly structured where they are more task-oriented than communication-oriented. And by that, I mean, is the patient working on skills in a naturalistic way versus an I need to get this done to get my reward way? Erin and I structure our co-treatments as natural and reinforcing as we can, given the limitations of providing services in an outpatient setting. We have a dream of one day having access to a more life skills type of environment where we can work on those functional life skills, of putting dishes away, completing laundry, things like that. But unfortunately, we don't, but that doesn't mean we can't work on functional life skills. This is where our ability to collaborate at a very high level has worked well for us. Erin brings her expertise in understanding behavior, and I bring my expertise in language, and more specifically AAC. So we have a patient that came to us, and the first thing we were told by the parents is that they tried AAC and it failed. He couldn't scan or discriminate between pictures. When we were evaluating him and we presented a receptive language task where he had to identify a picture in a field of two, he just grabbed the closest picture to him and gave it to us, and often before he even looked at it. So there was no scanning or anything. He rarely looked at the picture or the field, but he understood that he gave you this picture, I will get some type of reinforcement probably. So we quickly realized that our intervention had to look nothing like a school task-based intervention would. We learned that he was highly motivated by music and enjoyed eating snacks, and that was kind of our gateway in. We started having him request snacks and taught scanning by moving the snacks to different quadrants. We had preferred and non-preferred items, so it brought about a more natural consequence if we were to select an item he didn't want, and we gave it to him. And so we had to scan to correct it. We provided non-contingent reinforcement where he had access to music, but we kind of controlled the music, but he still had access to it, listening to it in the room. But he had to still request the snacks. So our therapy looked very real life for him. He will always have access to the music because he plays it on his iPad, but he doesn't have access or free reign access to foods at home all the time. So our therapy looked nothing like school because he also didn't have to sit at the table. We let him wander around the room and he will seek out his device to make a request. And let me tell you, he is scanning beautifully right now. And it's just, we were told he couldn't do it, but then once we kind of found the gateway in, through the music, through the snacks, letting him roam around the room, following his lead, and then, adding in that natural consequence when he selected an item he didn't want, it really brought about, oh, he can communicate, he can scan. We just had to look very different in our approach. So I strongly believe that his success is because of our ability to collaborate. After each session, we debrief and we talk about what went well and what didn't. Then we talk about what we should work on for our next session. We don't usually say like, great session or what a session, see you next week. We generally will spend as much time before our next patient to collaborate. We have a shared drive where we share therapy materials for our shared patients and for patients that aren't shared, but they're not shared, but they could benefit from the material that one of us made. And I could talk all day about our shared patients, but there's not enough time. But I could go on for hours because it's really fun to collaborate and I really enjoy it. Okay, so while Erin and I are able to collaborate very well, it is in part because we understand each other's language. So BCBAs and SLPs, so besides professional identity and using a multidisciplinary approach, another barrier to collaboration can be our specialties language. So BCBAs and SLPs have their own acronyms or words to reference part of communication or techniques. Even though the words may be different, sometimes the definition is the same or similar. So we know that language can be a barrier. This is true across disciplines. It is true for our complex communicators, and it's true for individuals who speak multiple languages. It can be a huge barrier to collaboration, but just because one profession has a different word, it doesn't mean that their field is trying to take away or diminish your language. They just have their own. We don't generally feel this way about second language learners. We take an interest in learning the different words that they have for the things we say. But for some reason, I've noticed this doesn't apply to the different words across disciplines. One important piece of collaboration is learning the language of your partner. I remember when I first started collaborating with BCBAs, I felt like they were speaking a different language and I was always translating it in my head. For a while, I felt like I was one step behind because by the time I translated in my head what they had said, they were on to the next topic. I didn't want to look incompetent and it almost prevented me from engaging with them because I constantly felt confused. My identity is tied to being perceived as a competent SLP, and I fear that this was negatively impacting how others saw me. But I admitted to my colleague at the time that I had no idea what she was talking about, but she was kind enough to teach me, and I in turn taught her the words I had for the same thing. So now I will teach you some of the words that I know. So this is not an exhaustive list, but some of the more common ones. And the definitions may not be exactly like a one-to-one, but it's a decent general definition. So we have mans, which is the ABA word or term, mans. In the speech world, we call them requests. But in general, they pretty much mean asking for items, asking to discontinue, asking for information. The ABA term for tacting in the speech world, we call it labeling. So naming. The ABA term for echoic in the speech world, we call it vocal imitation, and it's repeating back what was said. The ABA term for listener response, the speech word is following directions. And so the common example is following directions, following verbal directions. And then the ABA term for interverbal in the speech world, we say scripts, commenting, answering questions. So common examples would be memorized phrases and cues, reciprocal conversation. So I think once you start to learn, the language of your partner, the language of other disciplines, it definitely will foster more collaboration and really decrease this feeling of we're not on the same team, we're not on the same page. I really recommend, taking the time to learn the language of your partner. It will just really help foster that collaboration. And on to Erin.
I just wanted to add in this slide because it does come up often, or at least I've experienced it often. Professionals from both fields probably know the saying that behavior is communication, right? And they're usually referencing disruptive or socially inappropriate behaviors. But communication in any form is also a behavior. When a person exhibits an inappropriate, harmful, disruptive, or dangerous behavior, it's often easy for teams to recognize the needs for a transdisciplinary approach, at least with a BCBA. However, by ethical standards, BCBAs are expected to identify and prioritize socially significant behavior change. So if you were asked to make a list of socially significant behaviors that make a difference to a person and how they socially interact, do you think you would say just don't hit people? Or do you think there might be a little more to it? So even individuals that appear well behaved might need more work on motivations, initiations, expanding reinforcers, or generalization with communication skills. They might need multiple variations of words or phrases to communicate in different environments. So they may need a BCBA on the team to work on some of these things. Most teams understand the concept that challenging behavior is a form of communication, but ABA also considers that communication in any form is behavior, and it's a pretty socially significant one, impacting multiple domains. So it's very often a goal when a child appears well behaved, they still have socially significant issues going on, especially communication. And so, from the perspective of both professions, we can probably agree that being able to communicate functionally is socially significant. ASHA defines functional communication as the ability to convey or receive a message in natural environments, regardless of the mode, to communicate effectively and independently. Our ability or lack of ability to communicate impacts nearly every facet of our life. It's a shared goal, and the more we can learn and accept approaches that combine the strengths of our two fields, the more progress our clients will achieve, especially in this area of functional communication. So this is a quote from Bob Williams, a self-advocate who's been heavily involved in the rights to those without vocal speech. He says the silence of speechlessness is never golden. We all need to communicate and connect with each other, not just in one way, but also in as many ways as possible. It's a basic human need, a basic human right, and much more than this, it is a basic human power. Without a functional means of communication, individuals with complex communication needs cannot participate in education, advocacy, receiving proper medical care, or taking a role in their medical care, gaining meaningful employment, or engaging socially with friends, family, or their community. So this is the shared work of SLPs and BCBAs alongside others in the Village of Support.
So part two of our presentation is why are we focusing on high-tech AAC? So what is AAC first? It is augmentative and alternative communication. It is a multimodal means of communication, not including spoken language. So augmentative, it supports unmet communication needs regardless of vocal speech presence or absence. Alternative is it replaces speech. Aided and unaided. So unaided is no material other than one's own body, and aided is low, mid, high tech, requires some form of materials and equipment. Just to kind of go back a bit, so augmentative. So my patients who use AAC for augmentative purpose have some spoken language, but it may not be sufficient enough to meet their daily communication needs, or their intelligibility decreases with longer utterances, or if they're sick or fatigued. So AAC in this manner is used more like an aid to ensure that they have a way to repair communication breakdowns, and that communication is always remains positive. Then for my patients that use it for an alternative, reason is I think that it's what most people think of when they think of why a person would need AAC, which is problematic. It can impact the choice of some parents from pursuing it as they think it will replace spoken language, which we'll talk about later down the myth section of this presentation. But there are patients that do not have the ability to use spoken language. And so AAC in this manner really becomes their voice, and it is an alternative means of communication. So what is high-tech AAC? It's an electronic computerized communication system. It's dedicated communication devices or iPads, communication applications, and speech generation. Those are kind of the things you think about, or really what is high-tech AAC. We are not talking about communication books, eye gaze boards, PECs, or switches. We're talking more dedicated devices and iPads with that generated speech output. So why focus on high-tech AAC? What are some of the advantages? So many people have access to technology. They have phones, iPads, computers. Years ago, maybe less so, but in today's age, especially with our young adult patients, they have some type of experience with or exposure to technology. And with the advancement of technology, we have been able to develop communication applications, which require significantly less maintenance than pictures. Devices don't require printing, lamination, Velcro, which pictures or low-tech AAC systems often do require, which can also be a financial burden to families. Buying a laminator, printing in color, purchasing Velcro. and not losing the text pictures. It also allows for more, just-in-time programming, which low tech doesn't. It also does not require a translator, which I have often experienced with patients who use sign language or worse, use modified signs. I will admit, I do not know sign language, and I know even less modified sign language. So for my patients, if they're using sign language, they will often require the assistance of someone to translate for them. So if we're looking to increase their independency with communication, I strongly advise against a communication system that more often than not will require someone to translate for them. That removes the power of communication from them and places it in the hands of someone else. It is not uncommon to see a person out in the community with an iPad, whether that's for reinforcement or communication. So before having a device that's almost like having a neon sign that said, oh, hey, I have a disability. Now, I don't think a person would look twice at someone having an iPad in their hands. So much less stigma, which is great. And with the ubiquitous of technology, many direct support staff and employed caretakers are familiar with technology. They can much more easily learn their client's communication system if given the time. They have a foundation that they can build upon in regards to teaching them how to add buttons or problem solve technical issues. And as I mentioned earlier, high tech can complement any form of communication. Our focus is not to take away from other forms of AAC that are working for patients, or to assume that high tech AAC is for everyone. So if a person uses pictures or signs functionally, it should be used and expanded to their highest potential for communication. But we do think high-tech AAC should be an option. So the goal really is to find the best system that will enable an individual to effectively and efficiently engage in a variety of communication functions, across different settings and with different communication partners, as it's necessary for a positive quality of life outcome. So we're looking at these different, communication applications. And so it's really important to take note that apps are not created equally. So it's not a one size fits all, just because one of your clients does really well with LAMP doesn't mean all your clients will do really well with LAMP. They vary based on features, displays, organizations, these apps differ because they offer different things. And so, as I just said previously, if one client or student or patient is successful with the communication application, that does not mean the same application will work for another. So let's take a look at some of the different communication applications. Please note this is not an exhaustive, all-inclusive list, but just some of the more popular apps that I've come across in my clinic. So I'll just kind of briefly name them. So starting with the top left, we have Proloquo, then we have Touch Chat, then we have Snap Core, and then on the top right, we have LAMP, we have Snapscene, and then Go Talk Plus. So you'll probably kind of see right off the bat, most of these apps are grid-based. So that's just one of the ways that they're designed. But you'll see that Snapscene is more of a picture. Then some apps, the ones that are grid-based, some of them have linked pages that allows for more efficient language generation. So one of the, I think, more interesting features of Touch Chat is that as you build your sentence, it will link you to pages with the correct verb tense. So it almost kind of like builds it grammatically for you as you navigate the system. So if I have a patient and they're starting a sentence and they say I or I am, the verbs that'll come up on the page after they select am will be present progressive. So it'll be like going, eating, drinking, playing. And then it'll generally, once they hit that, it'll go to the topic page. So it's really cool, really fast and efficient way of, formulating that utterance. Whereas with Proloquo, you can still obviously formulate a grammatical utterance, but there's maybe an extra step so when I'm on Proloquo and I do I am, and if I want to say I am eating, I have to hold down the eat button and then the verb tenses will pop up. And then I have to hit eating. And then I would have to navigate then to the topic page of the different foods. So some apps are a little bit easier with generation of language, the more grammatical ones. And some of them are just have a little bit more steps, but that's what you'll be assessing when you do your AAC assessments. And then a lot of them, most of them are very robust, which means there's, a lot of language because we communicate for a lot of different reasons, beyond requesting. So we'll touch base on that as well later on, but that's really important thing to know as well, is how much access to language do they have in this system? How much is already pre-programmed and how much am I going to have to add in if I have to? A lot of the home pages already have high frequency important words. So, you want those really high important ones easily accessible. So a lot of them have help on the homepage. A lot of them have like yes, no, or want, or eat, go. Those are ones that are probably used more often. Some apps also, well, not some, primarily Snapseed uses what's called a visual scene display. This is used a lot more for early communicators. They have a photo or a picture that is used to communicate a message, and they have like hotspots that you can circle on it. These pictures provide a lot of high-level visual contextual information, and it helps kind of develop those early language skills, that social reciprocity with communication, exchanging information beyond requesting, your turn, or this is my mom, or go. So that's a really cool one too. Sometimes we also use the Snapseed in our patients or in our sessions to kind of talk about displaced talk. So families will sometimes email us pictures of their vacations or their trips. So, I can have a patient who uses LAMP, and we'll kind of use Snapseed, and we'll put hotspots on there too. And he can kind of, touch the hotspot on the device, or I'm sorry, on the Snapseed, and it could have a sentence, I saw a pig. And then he can also say that on his device as well. It's a really cool way he seems to love it. He really looks at himself. So these are some fun apps these are just some apps you can use to kind of assess when you go through your assessment. And so you've gone through your assessment and you identify the best communication application for your patient. You also want to look at what would be the best speech generating device. Again, this is not an exhaustive, all-inclusive list, but these like house the communication application. So you have the VIA Pro in the top left corner. You have the Accent, the Nova Chat, the Quick Talker Freestyle through AbleNet, and Tobii Dynavox. So it's important to note that some applications are only available for a particular SGD. So VIA Pro, Accent, they're through PRC Satillo, which they do LAMP and touch chat. So you wouldn't be able to get like a Tobii Dynavox and have LAMP put on Tobii Dynavox. They're really kind of just like proprietary to their own application. That's not to say that some of them, which are more like the Quick Talker Freestyle, has access to all of it. So it really depends on the vendor and who is, proprietary to what they have. But it's really important to note when you're looking at your SGD, you want to look at the features of the SGD. So some of them have built-in speakers, which is really important, I feel, for like a safety issue. So I often will really consider, what environments is my patient going to be in? Are they going to be in the backseat of the car where maybe mom or dad or the staff is playing music? You want them to be able to hear the device if they're sitting in the backseat. If you're in a noisy classroom, you want to be able to, or the cafeteria, you want to make sure that your device is loud enough to be heard. If you're on the community, you want to make sure your device is loud enough to be heard. So looking at SGDs, maybe having external speakers is a really important feature that you want to have. And so some will have them and some won't. Different weights and different sizes, a little 5-year-old kiddo, the VIA Pro is probably going to be a little too big for them. So maybe you kind of want to go with like a smaller device, something that's a little bit more lightweight. Then you have the different operating systems. So some of them operate on iOS and some of them are more Android based. And that's an important question too, is sometimes I ask the family, like, which system are you more familiar with? If you can kind of figure out that as well. Durability. Some of my patients like to throw when they're angry. That's an important factor to know, is can these things hold up if they were to get tossed or if they were just simply to be dropped. And then there's alternate access options, eye gaze, switch capabilities, all these things you want to kind of think about. All these things you do want to think about when you are doing your AAC evaluation and looking at SGDs. So why do we communicate? Well, we communicate for so many reasons. And as I mentioned previously in the slide about the communication applications, I talked about having a robust language system. This is why having a robust language system is incredibly important. So think about your day. Why have you communicated today? Did you share information with a colleague about your weekend? Did you ask for coffee at Dunkin' this morning? Did you tell your child for the 10th time that they cannot let the cat bring a dead bird into the house as a gift? Is it just my family? I don't know. We communicate for so many reasons. So giving our patients access to a robust language system and modeling these different functions of communication is so important. We want them to have the ability to generate their own utterances. We want them to be able to communicate effectively across settings with different people in different contexts. So we want to, express our wants and needs, to share information, to establish relationships, to protest, comment, direct actions of others, to ask and answer questions, share personal information, to seek medical attention and care, and to share emotional states. So it's not an exhaustive list here either, but these are just some of the, some of them. So, but how do we know what communication system and SGD is the best fit for them? Simple. We need to conduct an AAC assessment. We will offer a future CEU about AAC assessment, but we will briefly touch on it here. So in our clinic, it is not uncommon for us to hear that they didn't know their adult child client could be evaluated for services or even come to our clinic. So just like in school, there's this assumption that there's a point where services are no longer available. Like you graduate school and your services stop because they age out. But that's not the case for us. The need to communicate doesn't stop because a patient is no longer at school or is older than 21, 22. So on the other end, for our young kiddos, the idea of waiting for skills to develop before evaluating them for AAC is preposterous. We make decisions based on current skills. And because most often skills continue to develop over time, we will continue to make recommendations and changes to their system as needed. So like I said, there will be a CEU available on this in the coming months, but this was just kind of a nice little tease about AAC assessment and why you should offer it, regardless of age, regardless of capabilities, and just the continued importance of doing ongoing dynamic assessment over time. So now that we've learned a little bit about AAC, let's briefly look at the common myths. So these are common ones that I hear in my clinic, that I read about in the research. Probably the most common one is that it negatively impacts the development of spoken language. We know this is not true. Research has shown that spoken language will remain the same or increase in the presence of AAC, but rarely, if ever, decreases. And I've heard this a lot from my patients, especially when it's used for like an augmentative part, or it's used augmentatively for them. I can't tell you how many patients have come back to me, or they're the parents of the patients, and they will say that their spoken language has increased since using the device. And they're just like flabbergasted. And I'm always like, yeah, it'll help them. They're going to choose the path of least resistance to communicate. But sometimes it's just harder to get the words out, using spoken language. So we need to give them another way to do it. And, I think their fear was, oh my God, they're going to stop talking. But no, they're talking more and they're talking with more success. And so communication is becoming so much more positive for them. Then the next myth is only individuals who do not use spoken language should use AAC. Everyone can benefit. And to be honest, we all use some form of AAC. We gesture, we write, we point. So AAC it's a universal way of communicating. And there's really so many different elements within AAC, right? It's not just high tech, it's low tech, mid tech, gestures, pointing, facial expressions. It's so diverse. It's really cool. AAC intervention is a last resort intervention. It should not be. It can be used in tandem with spoken language, while it's developing. I always say it's better to use it and not need it than to wait years to try it while waiting for other skills to develop, because then you miss out on years of having a functional way to communicate. And probably over that time, they've developed probably a dangerous way, right, of communicating. And that's probably why I need to collaborate with Erin, because they weren't given a appropriate way to communicate or another way to communicate when they were younger, as their spoken language was or was not developing. And individuals need to be a certain age or have intact cognition to use AAC. As we mentioned previously, no, we make recommendations for AAC based on current skills. It's not an age thing. And the last myth is only individuals who have disabilities use AAC. So again, it goes with only individuals who do not use spoken language to use AAC. These kind of go together. Um, Everyone can use it. I mean, ask yourself today, or ask yourself, how did you communicate today that did not involve spoken language? And if you sent an email, if you waved, if you smiled, you use some type of AAC. So um, that's why this is important. And that's why we're bringing you the CU series.
I will talk just a little bit about our third part as far as why did we choose adults to focus on in the CEU series. So communication in adulthood is important. Um, there's a lot of places that we use it, and it's arguably more important than in childhood. And maybe you're going to be in the community more often, interacting with unfamiliar people more often. Group homes and community support staff might change more often. So again, new people that you're getting used to and you need to be able to communicate with. There's also this increased expectation, just socially in our communities, for independent and understandable communication in adults. We don't have that kind of scaffolding that we have in schools and in childhood, other people around us to help us. So that scaffolding isn't always there or as strong in adulthood. And we need to continue to build that independence. There's also a greater need to use communication to form relationships. So we're not just relying on proximity. When you're in school, you're in close proximity to people, but when you want to form relationships in adulthood, you need to be able to communicate and seek them out in different types of areas. So we know that the services, supports and services after graduation change dramatically. That transition from student to adult services is also often referred to as a cliff because many of the services just drop off after graduation. And as a result, individuals with complex communication needs often experience regression or stalled progress in communication around this time. And again, this occurs at arguably a time when quality of life is more important than ever. So some of the statistics here on the screen, just looking at the National Longitudinal Study looked at young adults and their ability to understand, ability to communicate, and their ability to converse. And you can see there's a fair number of people in that a lot of trouble or not able at all, but still even more, the majority are having a little trouble or more trouble. But in contrast, if you look at the graph next to it, these speech and language therapy services, at age 17, we have 66% of the population with autism receiving these services. And after high school, it goes down to 10%. So we really see this drop off in the availability of services. Drexel University's Autism Center summarized the National Longitudinal Survey data from 2015. And it showed that over half of young adults still in school were accessing services, including speech and language services, occupational therapy, social work, transportation, case management, and personal assistance services. Whereas when you look at young adults after high school, only 26%, 26% of young adults received no services at all. But we know that there are people out there that need these services. And you might be working with some of them or interacting with some of them. So there's, again, it's this significant disparity in the breadth and width of supports and services for adults compared to children with autism and intellectual disabilities or developmental disabilities. And just because a person has aged out of school doesn't mean they have aged out of their disability, or it doesn't mean that they don't need to communicate anymore, or that they don't have the same needs at 21 to 25 and potentially to 30. So we really want to stress in this series and bring attention to the services of adults because they're not too old and it's never too late. Communication is necessary in all stages of life. Arguably all of us, hopefully, improve in our communication, the way we communicate over our adult years. And we want individuals with disabilities to be able, and autism to be able to do that as well. As Shannon had mentioned before, we hear that past services, we usually hear from parents or guardians that past experiences with AAC have been shown to impact that present. So they might be a little more dismissive of trying it in adulthood, or just a little more pessimistic about it being successful. And a lot of times we end up seeing this gap, right, where there's some device abandonment. Maybe somebody was using an AAC device in school, and then here they are maybe 5, 6 years post school, and they haven't used it since they graduated. And that's that device abandonment. We see that commonly in our services with adults. Again, some of those anecdotal reasons that people come in with, they might say it didn't work in the past, so it won't work now. They might say we tried it, they never took to it, or they only watched videos on the device and didn't really use it effectively. And again, we think that this interprofessional practice especially lends itself to solving these problems and helping adults to be able to communicate with AAC and giving it a try again. um, so maybe the AAC application, a lot of times we see people come in and that has not been updated with relevant vocabulary. So again, you can tell it really hasn't been used post high school. We see adults coming into the clinic, they still have school folders on their front page. Or the applications weren't updated with new people, places, or vocabulary that reflected their life situation. So a lot of times that's an area where we need to address. And again, looking more at how do we build a robust vocabulary for this person and not necessarily link it specifically to one setting like school. We want it to be able to apply to multiple settings that they're going to encounter as adults. Another thing that we see often is highly customized AACs coming in. So they're very modified for the individual. And a lot of, again, specific to context types of communications rather than how might this person, what are the many ways this person is going to need to communicate over time. So many old AAC programs we see really weren't designed for long-term use. So their buttons or folders on the homepage that might have been applicable to 12th grade life, but they're not really relevant at all to a 25-year-old life. And the problem is that when these applications become so highly modified, it becomes difficult for language to grow. So I won't go into a long list, but some of the customizations that we notice can be problematic if we remove the speech bar. A lot of times maybe an individual might be only saying one word now, but eventually we want them to string the words together. We want to keep that speech bar there for that projected language, not the necessarily now language. Changing buttons colors, coloring the buttons to maybe gain visual attention, or moving buttons to the homepage that don't necessarily need to be there. Instead of focusing on teaching the motor plan, it is okay to draw attention to certain very important phrases or things that we're teaching right away, but overall we want to teach a motor plan with the AAC so that individuals again can access all of the features that are available on it. And changing buttons to only speak phrases. Sometimes as Shannon mentioned in Touch Chat, the software is designed to help build these phrases or sentences. But sometimes we'll see a single button that says, "Can I have a drink of water, please?" Which again, in the moment might make sense, but maybe they want to ask for a soda later, and that's the only button that they've learned to ask for a drink, and it's always going to be water. So we usually discourage this highly customization. And again, one of the ways to get past that, as we referenced, is doing a really good assessment and really looking at how the program's working for the individual. In our September session is going to be focused on assessment. So we want to be thinking about how the program can support lifelong language, not just circle time or the school cafeteria or the one job training program the person is involved in. And like I said, in September, we will talk more about assessment. You'll get some great information from our speaker on that. So why do we choose this specific topic for our series? Another reason, besides what we've talked about today, the CEUs that focus on adults are not as common. So we don't see them out there talking about, again, AAC with children, and really this collaboration between SLPs and BCBAs. They're really the big takeaways we want you to gain from this whole series, and hopefully you'll have a lot more information to go forward with to apply to the patients and the clients that you work with, and the families and teams that you work with. So, like I said, beginning in September, we're going to host monthly webinars in the evening for 60 to 90 minutes each. The live webinars will run through May of 2025, excluding December. We won't have a live webinar in December. But each live webinar will be available asynchronously on our site a few weeks after the event. So if you can't catch it live, you'll be able to go to our website and watch it later. And then in June, July, and August of next year, we'll be offering 3 more asynchronous trainings. So the great thing about these is that CEUs will be offered for all of the trainings through December of 2025, and all of the trainings will have CEUs for both SLPs and BCBAs. So there'll be information that will apply to both fields, and hopefully will be applicable to you in your practice. So we're excited to bring you the series and have a number of amazing speakers planned. These are our first 3 for the fall in September, October, and November. Please keep an eye on our website and register for them, and we'll see you back soon. Thank you so much.